The morning Henrietta Brooks found her father's body cold in his favorite chair, the ranch hands were already whispering about who would take the land. She had walked into the study at first light, carrying a tin mug of coffee she had brewed herself because the housekeeper hadn't arrived yet, and she found him there with his hands folded across his chest, like he had simply decided to stop living sometime in the dark hours before dawn. William Brooks had been 61 years old, and the ranch he had carved out of the Texas hill country south of San Antonio had taken 30 of those years to build. He had fenced in 1,200 acres of grazing land, dug 3 wells by hand, built a house with a wraparound porch, and put up a barn that could hold 40 horses without any one of them touching another. He had done it all, and he had done most of it with his daughter working beside him. Henrietta was 24 years old on the morning she found him, and she had spent the last 6 of those years as his closest partner. She could read a cattle ledger as well as any man in Bixar County. She could identify sick cattle by their gait before any symptoms showed in their eyes. She could negotiate with feed suppliers and water rights attorneys and neighboring ranchers with equal confidence. She had done all of this while being a woman in 1882, which meant she had done all of this while being told, in ways both loud and quiet, that it was not entirely proper for her to be doing any of it. But William Brooks had not been a man who cared what other people thought was proper. He had raised his daughter the way he had wanted to raise her, teaching her everything he knew, because her mother had died when Henrietta was 11 and there had been no one else, and because he had recognized early on that his daughter possessed a mind sharper than any he had encountered in 30 years of ranching. He had never remarried. He had never apologized for the way he raised her. And he had, according to Henrietta's firm belief, intended for her to have everything when he was gone. The trouble was the will. William Brooks had written his will in 1874, 8 years before his death, when Henrietta had been only 16 years old. At that time, he had divided his estate into 3 equal parts, 1/3 to Henrietta, 1/3 to his brother Gerald Brooks, who lived in Austin, and 1/3 to be held in trust for any grandchildren William might one day have. Gerald Brooks had arrived at the ranch within 4 days of the funeral, riding a fine black horse and wearing a suit that looked like it had been pressed that same morning, and he had brought with him a lawyer named Doyle Cummings, whose collar was too tight and whose eyes were too close together. Gerald was 54 years old and had been a banker in Austin for most of his adult life. He had visited the ranch exactly twice in the 8 years since the will had been written, both times during the Christmas season, both times staying no more than 3 days. He had never helped with the cattle. He had never repaired a fence. He had never sat with William during the difficult spring of 1879, when a drought had threatened to ruin everything, and Henrietta had ridden to 4 neighboring ranches to negotiate emergency water-sharing agreements that saved the herd. Gerald had done none of those things, and yet he stood in the study on the 5th day after William's death and told Henrietta that he intended to petition the court to have her portion of the inheritance set aside on the grounds that she was not fit to manage property of this size. Henrietta had looked at him steadily. She was tall for a woman of that era. With dark brown hair she wore pinned severely when she was working and loose when she was in the house, and she had her father's pale gray eyes that could look at a thing and take its full measure without flinching. She looked at Gerald with those eyes and said, "I have been managing this property for 6 years, Uncle Gerald. What exactly is your understanding of the word unfit?" Gerald had not met her gaze. He had looked instead at the carpet, then at the ceiling, then at his lawyer. Doyle Cummings had cleared his throat and said that the court would determine what was appropriate, and that a young unmarried woman with no formal business education could not be expected to handle the complex legal and financial demands of a ranch of this magnitude. He had used words like vulnerable and impractical and susceptible to exploitation, and each word had landed on Henrietta like a small stone dropped from a height, not enough to wound but enough to bruise. She had said nothing more that day. She had gone out to the barn and stood among the horses for a long time, and then she had walked to the south fence and looked out at the land, which was green in the early October way that Texas hill country sometimes managed, and she had told herself that she was going to fight. The problem was that fighting a legal battle in 1882 Texas required a lawyer, and the two lawyers in the nearest town of Crestwater had both already agreed to represent Gerald Brooks. Henrietta suspected money had changed hands. The third option was a man in San Antonio, a courthouse attorney named Franklin White, who had handled her father's water rights negotiations years earlier. But when she rode to see him, he had looked at her over his spectacles with something between sympathy and exhaustion, and told her that the case was not one he wished to take on, given that Gerald Brooks was a man with significant banking connections in Austin. She had ridden back to the ranch in the late afternoon, her mare kicking up dust on the dry road, the sun going red and wide behind the cedar hills, and she had felt something very close to despair. Not the weeping kind of despair, because Henrietta Brooks had not been much given to weeping even as a child, but the cold and hollow kind that settles in the chest like water in a stone well. She did not yet know that Jacob Underwood had arrived in Crestwater that same afternoon. Jacob Underwood was 28 years old and had been riding for 3 weeks from a failed ranch in New Mexico, where a combination of bad luck, a collapsed partnership, and a summer of almost biblical heat had left him with nothing but a good horse, a bedroll, a saddle that needed restitching on the left flank, and a law degree from a school in Missouri that he had completed 5 years earlier, and then largely abandoned in favor of working cattle. He was not a tall man, but he was built solidly, with square shoulders and hands that showed a decade of outdoor work, and he had a face that people tended to trust without knowing exactly why. Dark brown hair that was a little too long, brown eyes with gold in them, a scar on his jaw from a barbed wire incident in 1879. He had come to Texas because Texas was where work was, and he had stopped in Crestwater because his horse had thrown a shoe just outside of town. He was sitting in the blacksmith's workshop, watching the new shoe being fitted, when he heard 2 men talking at the livery stable next door. The livery walls were thin, and the afternoon was quiet, and Jacob Underwood had never been the sort of man who could make himself stop listening when something interesting was being said. What he heard was this: Gerald Brooks from Austin was going to take his niece's ranch away from her, and it was practically already done because she had no lawyer, and it was a shame really, but what could you expect? A girl trying to run 1,200 acres alone. It wasn't natural, and Gerald had come with a real Austin lawyer, and the judge who would hear the case was Emmett Ford, who was known to be traditional in his thinking about property and women. Jacob listened to all of this and said nothing. He paid the blacksmith, mounted his horse, and rode to the one hotel in Crestwater, a 2-story building called the Douglas House that smelled of lamp oil and old wood. He ate supper in the attached dining room and then sat in the corner for a long time drinking coffee and thinking about New Mexico and about law school and about what it meant to have worked hard for something and then have it taken from you through no fault of your own. In the morning, he rode out to the Brooks Ranch. Henrietta was mending fence on the east side of the property when she heard the horse, and she turned with the wire cutters still in her hand to see a man she didn't know pulling up on a well-kept roan. She did not put the wire cutters down. In 1882, a woman alone on a Texas ranch did not put her tools down when a stranger appeared on the property. "Miss Brooks," Jacob said, keeping his hands visible on the reins. "You have the advantage of me," she said. "My name is Jacob Underwood. I was a lawyer in Missouri, and I've been ranching in New Mexico for the past 4 years, and I heard in town last night that you need representation for a property dispute." She studied him the way she studied everything, thoroughly and without hurry. "Who told you that? Men talking in a livery stable. That's a thin thread to follow to someone's gate." "Yes," he agreed. "But I was sitting there with nothing particular ahead of me, and what I heard seemed wrong, so I followed it." She turned back to the fence, pulled a section of wire taut, and wrapped it around the post with practiced efficiency before speaking again. "Every lawyer in 2 counties has turned me down. Franklin White in San Antonio said the case wasn't worth taking. What makes you think you'd do any better?" Jacob had been thinking about this since the night before. "Because I have nothing to lose," he said. "White has a reputation to protect and existing clients to worry about. I rode into this county yesterday with a horse and a bedroll. Gerald Brooks can't threaten anything I have because I don't have anything." Henrietta turned to look at him again. There was something in the straightforwardness of that answer that caught her attention. She had encountered a great deal of flattery in her 24 years, men who told her she was clever for a woman, capable for her sex, impressive given her circumstances. This man had not said any of those things. He had simply told her the truth about his situation, which was that he was available because he was broke. "When was the last time you argued a case?" she asked. 3 years ago. "Texas law." "Missouri law, but the principles are similar and I have time to study the Texas codes before the hearing." "When is the hearing?" "From what I heard, Gerald Brooks filed the petition 2 days ago." "In a county this size, you're probably looking at 3 weeks. She folded the last piece of wire, picked up her gloves from the fence post, and looked at him with those pale gray eyes that seemed to take a full accounting of everything they rested on. "Come up to the house," she said. "I'll make coffee and you can tell me what exactly you think you can do." He followed her up the long slope to the ranch house, and he noticed as he rode that the fences were in good repair, that the cattle in the south pasture were healthy and well distributed, that the barn was freshly whitewashed, and that the kitchen garden beside the house had been planted with the kind of careful rotation that someone who understood both soil and seasons would use. This was not a property that had been left to drift. This was a property that had been tended with precision and intelligence. Inside, the house was clean and organized without being precious about it. Working boots by the door, a coat rack with practical gear, a desk in the side room covered with ledgers and receipts and carefully labeled folders of documents. He saw her watching him look at the desk and he said, "May I?" she said. "Go ahead." He spent 20 minutes going through the ledgers while she made coffee. By the time she set the cup in front of him, he had seen enough to understand that Henrietta Brooks had been running this ranch with full competence for at least 5 years. The records were meticulous. Every transaction was documented. The cattle counts, the feed costs, the seasonal water usage, the negotiations with neighboring ranches, all of it was there in her handwriting, clear and precise. "Your father signed the ledgers," he said. "Yes, but he didn't write them." She sat down across from him. "No. Is there anyone who can confirm that? Ranch hands, suppliers, neighbors?" "Most of them," she said. "The hands have been here long enough to know who did what. Tom Hatch has been foreman for 9 years. He'll say what's true." Jacob turned another page. "Doyle Cummings will argue that signing the ledgers means your father reviewed and approved all the decisions. That's a reasonable argument." "My father was in poor health for the last 2 years," Henrietta said, and there was a careful steadiness in her voice that told him how recently this had become past tense. "He reviewed the ledgers because I showed them to him and he trusted my judgment, but toward the end he couldn't have managed the daily operations himself." "Do you have a doctor who saw him during that time?" "Dr. Aldous Payne in Crestwater. He came out 3 or 4 times a year." Jacob nodded, writing on a piece of paper he had found on the desk. "What does the will actually say? Do you have a copy?" She went to the desk, opened a drawer, and produced a folded document that she set before him. He read it carefully. It was exactly as he had heard. 1/3 to Henrietta, 1/3 to Gerald, 1/3 in trust for grandchildren. Gerald's petition, as Jacob understood it from the conversation at the livery, wasn't about the will itself, but about Henrietta's capacity to manage her portion, with Gerald seeking to have the court appoint him as administrator of the entire estate on the grounds that she was unsuited to independent management of property of that scale. "He's not trying to take your inheritance outright," Jacob said. "He's trying to have himself appointed administrator, which means he'd control the ranch, make all the decisions, and you'd receive income at his discretion. Henrietta's jaw tightened slightly, which amounts to the same thing. Yes, Jacob said, it does. He looked at the will again. There was a line near the bottom that he read twice, then a third time. Your father wrote this in 1874. I know, he never updated it. No, he always said there was time and then there wasn't. Did he ever express his intentions clearly, to you or to others, in letters, conversations that were witnessed? She was quiet for a moment. He said it to me many times, that this was my home and my work and he wanted me to have it. She paused. He said it to Tom Hatch. He said it to our neighbor, Mr. Calloway, who ranches the property to the north. He said it to Dr. Payne. Another pause, longer. He never put it in writing after I was an adult. He just kept saying there was time. Jacob felt the weight of that settle between them. It was not an unusual story, a man who meant to update his will and kept postponing, but the cost of that postponement was being paid now by this woman sitting across from him with her hands flat on the table and her gray eyes steady and careful. I can build a case, he said. It won't be simple and I won't promise you it's certain because I won't lie to you about odds, but I think it can be argued and I think it can be argued well. Why? She said. Tell me specifically. He liked that. He had told her he wouldn't lie and she was holding him to it. Because the law in Texas regarding property inheritance is not as settled on the question of a woman's competence as Doyle Cummings wants Judge Ford to believe. The argument that you are unfit to inherit is based entirely on your sex, not on any demonstrated incapacity, and the evidence in this house points strongly in the opposite direction. You have 6 years of records. You have witnesses who can speak to your management of this property. You have a track record that any man with the same record would be praised for. He set down his coffee. What you don't have is a man standing next to you saying he agrees with it. And that in 1882 still matters to a judge. There was a silence in the kitchen. A log shifted in the stove. Outside, the wind moved through the cedar trees in the long, low way it did in October. You're saying the law isn't fair, she said. I'm saying the law isn't always applied fairly, but that doesn't mean you can't win within it. Sometimes you fight the law that exists until you can change it. Right now, what exists gives you a path. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, I can't pay you much. I have operating funds and what's in the ranch account, but Gerald's lawyer has filed to freeze the estate assets pending the hearing. I know, Jacob said. I don't need much. A place to sleep, meals, and enough for incidentals if I need to file documents in San Antonio. She considered this. There's a bunkhouse. Tom Hatch and 2 hands use it, but there's space. That's fine. You'll take the case for a bunk and meals. He met her gaze. I'll take the case because what I heard in that livery stable was wrong, and I happen to have the training to say so in a courtroom. The bunk and meals just mean I won't be hungry while I'm doing it. Something shifted in her expression, though she kept it carefully controlled. Not softness exactly, but something adjacent to it, the particular look of someone who has been alone with a problem for a long time and has suddenly encountered a door they hadn't known was there. All right, Mr. Underwood, she said. You have a deal. He stayed. In the days that followed, Jacob Underwood worked harder than he had worked since law school. He rose before dawn and spent the first hour of every day going through the records Henrietta had kept, building his argument in organized notes that he pinned to the wall of the small side room she cleared for him to use as a study. He sent a letter to the county clerk requesting the official copy of the petition Gerald had filed, and when it arrived, he read Doyle Cummings's language with the particular kind of focused anger that comes from recognizing something dishonest dressed up in careful formal prose. Cummings had called Henrietta Brooks emotionally unsuited to independent financial decision-making and lacking the temperament required for the management of assets of this complexity. He had cited her unmarried status as evidence of social instability. He had described her 6 years of ranch management as a period during which her father's declining health had unfortunately prevented him from adequately supervising her activities. Every word was chosen to make her sound fragile without calling her fragile directly, to suggest incapacity without pointing to a single specific failure, because there were no specific failures to point to. The strategy was to use the general assumption of the time, that women could not manage property, and dress it in enough legal language that it would hold up in front of a traditional judge. Jacob wrote his response to each of those claims in turn, building a counter-narrative from the records, the ledger entries, the documented transactions, the letters from suppliers and neighboring ranchers that he found in Henrietta's meticulously organized files. He also rode to see Tom Hatch, who was a weathered man of about 50 with a straight back and careful speech, and who said without hesitation that Henrietta Brooks had been running that ranch in every practical sense for 6 years, and that William Brooks himself had said more than once that she was the best rancher he'd ever seen, and that he meant it without the qualification about her being a woman. Tom Hatch said he would testify to all of this, and he said it the way men who have decided something say things, without drama and without uncertainty. Jacob also rode to see Mr. Calloway, the neighbor to the north, a broad man of about 60 named Douglas Calloway who chewed tobacco and had sharp eyes, and listened to Jacob's explanation of the case with his arms crossed, and then said that William Brooks had told him in the summer of 1881, while they were fixing a shared fence line, that when he was gone the ranch was Henrietta's, and he pitied any man who tried to say different. Douglas Calloway said he would testify too. Dr. Aldous Payne, when Jacob found him at his practice in Crestwater, was a small, precise man who kept careful notes, and who confirmed that William Brooks had indeed been in declining health for the last 2 years of his life, that his physical limitations had increased significantly, and that on more than one occasion the doctor had observed Henrietta managing the operational details of the ranch while her father sat in the comfortable chair on the porch, and directed by conversation rather than by action. Dr. Payne was slightly more hesitant than the others, worried about the political implications of testifying against a man with Austin banking connections, but he was also a doctor who believed in accuracy, and after a long conversation, he agreed to provide a written statement attesting to William Brooks's physical condition. Jacob spent his evenings at the kitchen table across from Henrietta, going over the case piece by piece. She asked sharp questions and caught errors in his reasoning twice, which he acknowledged and corrected without embarrassment, and he noticed that she had a particular way of understanding the logic of an argument that was almost mathematical, like she was testing each step the way she would test a fence post before trusting it with weight. On the 4th evening, they were sitting with coffee going cold beside them, and the lamp turned up high, and she was reading one of his draft arguments when she put it down and said, "You mentioned in your counterfiling that you intend to argue that the standard of competence being applied is not neutral." "Yes," he said. "Meaning you intend to argue that the court is applying a different standard to me because I am a woman." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "Do you think Judge Ford will be receptive to that?" "Honestly, no, but I think it needs to be in the record. Even if it doesn't change his thinking today, it establishes a challenge to the basis of the ruling that could matter on appeal if necessary." She looked at him with the full weight of those gray eyes. "You're already thinking about an appeal." "I'm thinking about every possible road," he said. "I intend to win in Cord's courtroom, but I want every subsequent door to be open if that doesn't happen." She nodded slowly. "My father would have liked you," she said, and it was said simply, not as a compliment designed to please him but as an honest observation, which made it mean more. He felt something warm move through him and carefully redirected his attention to the paper in front of him. He had been aware, from that first morning by the fence, that Henrietta Brooks was a woman who would be difficult to stop thinking about once you started. She was not conventionally pretty in the delicate parlor fashion of 1882, but she was striking in the way that things built for purpose and kept in good working order are striking. Her face had been shaped by outdoor work and by intelligence and by a kind of self-contained confidence that didn't seek permission. Her hands were capable and she used them directly, reaching for what she needed without hesitation. She was serious, and she was funny when she chose to be, and she was entirely, completely herself in a way that Jacob, who had spent years watching people try to be what other people wanted, found remarkable. He kept these observations largely to himself, because he was here to do a job, and because she did not need the complication of a man with no money and no property deciding he had feelings for her during the hardest weeks of her life. But he noticed. On the 6th day, Gerald Brooks came to the ranch. He came in a buggy, with Doyle Cummings beside him, and he came unannounced, which Henrietta found either rude or calculated or both. She met them at the gate with Tom Hatch standing behind her left shoulder, and Jacob stayed on the porch of the house because he was still uncertain of his exact standing and did not want to create a confrontation that would complicate things before the hearing. Gerald was a heavy-set man with a well-trimmed mustache and the permanent expression of someone who believes they are being patient. He told Henrietta that he had come to discuss a settlement, meaning that she could accept a sum of money in exchange for relinquishing her claim to the ranch management, and she could retain a small residence on the property for as long as she remained unmarried. Henrietta listened to this offer with her arms at her sides and her face entirely still. Then she said, "No." Gerald seemed surprised that she had answered so quickly and so briefly. He said that it was a generous offer, that she should take time to consider it. She said she didn't need time. He said that the court hearing was 3 weeks away and that she didn't have legal representation and that the outcome was not likely to favor her and that she should think practically. She said she had legal representation. That surprised him more. He looked at the house, and Jacob, from the porch, gave him a slight nod. Gerald turned back to Henrietta. "A drifter you found somewhere," he said. "Doyle has 20 years of courthouse experience in Travis County." "Then I suppose we'll see what 20 years is worth against a good argument," Henrietta said. She turned toward the house and then paused and looked back at her uncle with an expression that was neither angry nor cold but simply direct, the expression of someone who has decided to look at something clearly and say exactly what they see. "My father built this ranch. I helped him build it. I have kept it running for 6 years, and I have the records to prove every decision I made. You have not been here. You don't know these cattle or this land or what it took to hold it through the drought of '79 or the fever year or any of the rest of it. Whatever a judge decides about the law, you and I both know the truth of this, Gerald. And I think you know it too." Gerald did not answer. He and Cummings drove their buggy back down the road, and Henrietta walked past Jacob into the house without speaking, and Jacob gave her a few minutes before he followed. He found her standing at the kitchen window looking out at the cattle in the south pasture, and her shoulders were not quite so straight as they had been at the gate, and her hands were pressed flat on the counter in a way that suggested she was using it for support. He didn't say anything immediately. He poured 2 cups of coffee because the pot was still warm and set one near her elbow and stood beside the window. After a while she said, "He'll go back and file something with the court today. He'll say I'm difficult and uncooperative." "Probably," Jacob said, "but Cummings already filed that you're emotionally unsuited, so also difficult isn't much of an escalation." She let out a short breath that was almost a laugh. It surprised her, he could tell. She turned to look at him, and something about the situation, the absurdity of it, seemed to catch her for just a moment. "I suppose that's true," she said. "You did well out there," he said. "You said exactly what needed to be said and nothing more." "I almost said more," she admitted. "I know, but you didn't." She picked up the coffee cup. "You were watching pretty carefully." "I was," he said, and he did not elaborate, but she looked at him for a moment longer than the practical situation required before she turned back to the window. The days continued to pass, and the hearing grew closer, and the work grew more intense. Jacob drafted and redrafted his opening argument. He corresponded with a law professor in Austin who had written on the question of Texas property rights and women, and received back a brief letter with 2 cited cases that turned out to be genuinely useful. He interviewed Tom Hatch formally, writing out the foreman's testimony in full and going over it twice to make sure Tom understood what questions Cummings might use to try to undermine his account. He also worked the ranch. He had not come here to be a guest, and he was not built for sitting at a desk all day. And in the hours between his legal work, he helped with whatever needed doing, fence repair and cattle rotation, and hauling water to the North Trough when the pump was sluggish. He worked alongside the hands, who were initially cautious about him and then gradually less so, because he worked without complaint and without pretension, and because he clearly knew cattle. Henrietta watched him work the way he had watched her. He caught her at it sometimes, from the corner of his eye, and each time she looked away with a composure that told him she had been looking longer than she'd meant to. On the 11th day, something happened that neither of them had anticipated. A man arrived from San Antonio, a cattle broker named Price Harmon who had done business with William Brooks in the past and who apparently hadn't heard about the pending legal dispute. He came to discuss the possible sale of 40 head of cattle, offering a good price. Henrietta met with him in the study and handled the negotiation with complete professionalism, and Jacob, who happened to be working in the adjacent room, could hear every word, and he found himself stopping what he was doing and just listening, because watching someone do what they're genuinely good at is a compelling thing. She did not accept Harmon's first offer. She countered, cited current market prices in San Antonio and the exceptional condition of the herd, and negotiated to a final figure that was $12 per head above what Harmon had started with. When Harmon left and Jacob appeared in the doorway, she was writing the figures in her ledger with the same methodical precision she brought to everything. 40 head at $62, he said. She glanced up. Yes. I'm going to cite this negotiation in the hearing, he said. The date, the amount, the final per head price, and what the market average was on that date. May I see the ledger entry when you're done? She turned the ledger toward him so he could read it. He leaned over the desk to look, which brought him close, and she stayed still. And for a moment they were both very aware of the small distance between them, and neither of them moved for slightly longer than was strictly necessary before he straightened and said thank you and went back to his work. On the 14th day, something went wrong. Jacob had ridden to Crestwater to file a supplementary motion and to pick up correspondence, and when he returned to the ranch in the early afternoon, he found a changed atmosphere. Tom Hatch met him at the barn gate with an expression of controlled tension and told him that Doyle Cummings had been to see the other 2 ranch hands, not Tom, but the younger men, Eddie Park and Lem Briggs, and had spoken to them privately. Tom didn't know exactly what had been said, but both men had come back looking uncomfortable, and Eddie Park had asked Tom whether they were going to have jobs after the hearing, which told you most of what you needed to know. Jacob went directly to the house and found Henrietta already aware of it, sitting at the desk with a stillness that indicated she was thinking hard. He's trying to frighten the hands, Jacob said. I know. If Eddie or Lem withdraws from the witness list, it hurts us, but it doesn't destroy anything. Tom is the most important, and Tom won't be moved. I know that, too. She looked at him. I'm more concerned about what else Cummings is willing to do. If he's willing to approach employees of this ranch before the hearing, what else is he considering? It was a fair concern, and Jacob took it seriously. He thought about it for several hours, going over the case from Cummings's perspective, trying to find where the weak points were, and whether any of them could be exploited by someone willing to bend the rules. The answer, when he found it, was the witnesses. He rode back to Crestwater that evening and called on Dr. Payne, and while the doctor hadn't been directly approached, he had received a letter from a colleague in Austin, suggesting that his written statement might create difficulties for his medical practice in the county. Jacob sat with Dr. Payne for over an hour, not pressuring him, just talking, and in the end the doctor said that a man who lets a letter from a colleague in Austin chain his account of what he actually observed is not the kind of doctor he intended to be. He said this with some firmness, as if settling something with himself, and Jacob thanked him and rode back to the ranch. He told Henrietta about it over supper. She listened with her hands folded on the table, and then she said, "He's more afraid of us than he let on when he came here." "Yes," Jacob said, "Cummings wouldn't be doing this if he thought the hearing was a simple matter." Something in her expression changed. "You think we can win?" "I always thought we could win, but yes, I think we're stronger than they expected." She looked at him across the table, and he looked back. And there was something in the kitchen that night that felt like more than two people preparing for a legal fight. The lamp was warm and the night outside was cool, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called once and then was quiet, and the space between them had been shrinking gradually and honestly over 2 weeks of hard shared work until it was not very large at all. Jacob was the one who looked away first. He picked up his notes. "I want to go over the opening statement again," he said. "All right," she said, and her voice was steady. But she was smiling slightly when she reached across the table for the papers, and he did not think she was smiling about the opening statement. The day before the hearing, a cold front moved through from the north, dropping the temperature by 15 degrees and bringing with it a low gray sky that made the world feel serious. Henrietta spent the morning doing her usual ranch work with a focus that Jacob recognized as how she managed anxiety, by moving through the things she knew how to do with the body while the mind worked separately. He spent the morning at the desk doing final preparation, reviewing every piece of evidence, every citation, every witness statement until he could have recited them from memory. In the afternoon, they sat together in the kitchen for a long time without speaking, which was the kind of silence that can only exist comfortably between people who have spent enough time together that the absence of words doesn't require filling. Eventually she said, "Whatever happens tomorrow," he waited, "I want you to know that what you've done here, coming here, building this case, it has meant a great deal to me, more than I've probably said." He set down the paper in his hands. "You haven't needed to say it." "No," she agreed, "but I'm saying it anyway." He looked at her carefully. There were things he might have said at that moment, things that had been accumulating over 2 weeks of proximity and shared purpose and the particular intimacy of fighting for something together. He chose to say one of them. "When this is over," he said slowly, "and I say when because I intend for it to go our way, I'd like to take you to dinner somewhere that isn't this kitchen." She looked at him with those gray eyes that took the full measure of everything. "In Crestwater," she said. "The only restaurant is the hotel, and they only serve one thing." "I know," he said. "I've been eating there when I go to town. It's not bad. It's beef stew regardless of the day of the week." "I like beef stew." She was quiet for a moment, and there was something in the quiet that felt like a decision being made carefully and honestly. "All right, Mr. Underwood," she said. "Dinner, after." "Jacob," he said. "After 2 weeks I think we can dispense with Mr. Underwood." The corner of her mouth moved. "Jacob," she said, and the words sat between them in the warm kitchen air like something that had been said and couldn't be unsaid, and neither of them wanted to take it back. The courtroom in Crestwater was a single large room on the second floor of the town hall, with high windows and wooden benches, and a raised platform for the judge that had been built from the same timber as everything else in town, which meant it creaked when weight shifted on it. Judge Emmett Ford was 60 years old, and had a broad face and a white beard, and the settled manner of a man who had spent decades making decisions and expected people to accept them. He had been a county judge in Texas since 1867 and had presided over land disputes, inheritance cases, and property claims throughout that time, and his decisions were known to be consistent, which could mean either fair or inflexible depending on which side of them you found yourself on. The room was fuller than Jacob had expected. The news of the hearing had clearly spread because most of the town's available residents seemed to have come to watch, which was not unusual in a place where a court hearing was one of the primary forms of public entertainment. He saw Douglas Calloway near the back, broad and solid. He saw Tom Hatch and, to his mild surprise, both Eddie Park and Lem Briggs sitting beside Tom, which meant Cummings's attempt to frighten them had not entirely succeeded. Gerald Brooks sat at one table with Doyle Cummings, both of them in suits that projected Austin respectability. At the other table, Henrietta Brooks sat straight-backed in the best dress she owned, dark green wool that she had pressed carefully, her hair pinned up with the precision she brought to everything, and beside her Jacob Underwood in the cleanest shirt he owned, which was not as fine as he might have wished but was pressed and tucked and represented the best available argument that he intended to be taken seriously. Cummings went first, as the petitioner's attorney. He was smooth and thorough. Jacob had to grant him that. He built his case in careful, almost reasonable-sounding language, referring to Henrietta's management as well-intentioned but unsupervised, describing the ranch's assets as requiring more sophisticated financial guidance than a young, unmarried woman might reasonably be expected to provide. He called the will structure as evidence that even William Brooks, who had loved his daughter, had seen fit to include a protective mechanism in the form of the trust, suggesting that he had been aware of limitations. He was careful not to say anything that could be directly characterized as cruel. He said everything cruel in language designed to seem like practical concern. When it was Jacob's turn, he stood before Judge Ford and he looked at the judge and he said, "Your Honor, I intend this morning to disagree with every word the petitioner has used to describe my client." He paused to let that settle, and he felt the room settle with it. Then he began. He went through Cummings's language point by point, and for each phrase he produced evidence. Unsupervised met 6 years of cosign ledgers, and Tom Hatch's testimony that William Brooks had reviewed every significant decision, that this was a partnership, not a daughter going unchecked while her father looked away. Well-intentioned but lacking in sophistication, met the negotiation records for the water-sharing agreements in 1879, the documented per-head pricing Henrietta had achieved with suppliers, the letter from cattle broker Price Harmon confirming the negotiation he had witnessed only 4 days earlier, and the price she had secured. He read the letter aloud. He read the ledger entries for the drought year, and then he called Tom Hatch to the stand. Tom Hatch gave his testimony with the simple directness of a man who has worked alongside someone for 9 years and knows their worth without any complicated feelings about it. He said that Miss Brooks had managed the ranch in every operational sense. He said that William Brooks had expressed on multiple occasions that his daughter was the best rancher he had known, and that he intended for her to have the property. He said that, in his opinion, based on 9 years of direct observation, there was not a man in Bixar County who managed cattle better. Cummings cross-examined and tried to suggest that Tom was merely loyal and that his opinion was therefore worthless, and Tom looked at him from the witness stand with the patience of a man who has seen a great deal and said, "I'm loyal to facts, Mr. Cummings. I've told you the facts." Douglas Calloway testified to the conversation with William Brooks on the fence line in 1881, during which William had said clearly that the ranch would be Henrietta's. Cummings tried to frame this as the kind of general statement that doesn't constitute legal intent, and Jacob rose to note that it had been the kind of statement made by a man to his neighbor while repairing a fence, the most practical of settings, suggesting it was not a casual sentiment but a considered conviction. Dr. Payne's written statement was entered into evidence, detailing William Brooks's physical decline and the observations the doctor had made of Henrietta managing the ranch's operations during his visits. Then Jacob made his final argument. He stood before the judge and he said, "Your Honor, the petitioner has argued that my client is unfit. He has used that word and others like it throughout this proceeding. I want to address that word directly because it is the foundation of this petition and it deserves examination. He paused. Unfit means not possessing the qualities required for a particular purpose. The question before this court is whether Henrietta Brooks possesses the qualities required to manage her portion of this inheritance. The evidence presented today answers that question clearly. 6 years of documented records showing competent management. A foreman with 9 years of observation attesting to her capability. A neighboring rancher repeating the words of the deceased regarding his intentions. A physician confirming the conditions under which she worked. The cattle on that ranch are healthy. The fences are maintained. The accounts are profitable. The property has increased in value under her management. He let that sit for a moment. The petitioner has not pointed to a single specific failure. Not one bad decision, not one financial loss, not one documented instance in which her management produced a negative outcome, because there are none. The petition before this court rests not on evidence of incapacity but on the assumption of it. The assumption that a woman, regardless of what she has demonstrably and provably done, cannot be trusted with property of this scale. Your Honor, I submit to you that an assumption is not a fact, and a court of law is a place where facts are what matter. The room was very quiet. My client is 24 years old, Jacob continued. She has worked this land for 6 years. She has kept detailed records of every decision made during that time. She has maintained a profitable ranch through a drought year and a disease year and fluctuating cattle markets. She has negotiated with suppliers, managed ranch employees, maintained relationships with neighboring landowners, and done all of it with the knowledge and approval of her father, who expressed his wishes clearly to multiple credible witnesses. If this court is being asked to determine whether Henrietta Brooks is fit to manage property, then the evidence says yes. And if this court finds otherwise, then this court will not be finding it based on anything Miss Brooks has done. It will be finding it based only on what she is. He sat down. Judge Emmett Ford sat with his hands folded for a long time, and the room waited. Henrietta was very still beside Jacob, her hands in her lap, and under the table, without thinking about it very much, Jacob had placed his hand beside hers, and after a moment her hand turned and her fingers were in his, and neither of them looked at the other but both held on. Judge Ford cleared his throat. He said he had heard the evidence and considered the arguments. He said that the question of a woman's capacity to manage property was one that courts had addressed inconsistently, and that he intended to address it based on what was before him. He said that the evidence of record-keeping, of documented management decisions, of witness testimony from long-term employees and neighbors, of the financial condition of the property, painted a clear picture. He said that the petitioner had failed to demonstrate any specific incapacity, and that an assumption of incapacity based on sex alone was not sufficient grounds to override clear demonstrated competence. He denied Gerald Brooks's petition. The room made a collective sound that was not quite applause, but was close to it. Henrietta's hand tightened on Jacob's, and she closed her eyes for exactly 1 moment and then opened them, and turned to look at him with an expression that was not triumphant, but was deeply, honestly relieved. And underneath the relief was something that was not relief at all. Something that had been building for 2 weeks of early mornings and late evenings and shared purpose and careful distance. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was the quietest he had heard it. "You built the case," he said. "Every record, every document, every connection to every witness, I just argued it. You argued it very well." "I meant every word," he said. Gerald Brooks sat rigid at his table and did not look at his niece. Doyle Cummings gathered his papers with the efficient movements of a man who has lost and has decided to manage it professionally. They left without speaking to Henrietta, Gerald pausing only at the door to look back once, and whatever he saw in her expression seemed to settle something in him too, because he turned away and walked out and the door closed behind him. The room began to empty. Tom Hatch came forward and shook Henrietta's hand with both of his, and Douglas Calloway clapped Jacob on the shoulder and said something gruff and approving. And Dr. Payne appeared from somewhere near the back and nodded at Jacob with the satisfaction of a man who had made the right choice about something. Eddie Park and Lem Briggs both looked enormously relieved, which confirmed that Cummings had indeed threatened their employment, and that they had come today partly out of the hope that it would work out. They walked out of the courthouse into the gray October afternoon, and the cold air after the warmth of the room was startling. Henrietta stood on the step and looked at the street of Crestwater, the familiar dry wood storefronts and the horses at the hitching posts and the two children running past on some errand of their own, and she breathed out slowly. Jacob stood beside her. He had not let go of her hand as they left the courtroom, and she had not removed it. They were standing on the steps of the town hall holding hands in a way that was very visible to anyone who happened to be looking, which was most of the people who had just filed out of the courtroom, and neither of them did anything about it. "I believe I owe you dinner," Jacob said. She turned to look at him. The gray light made her eyes look more blue than gray, and she had a strand of hair coming loose at her temple from the hours of sitting still, and she looked nothing like the idealized women in the fashion illustrations of that era and entirely like herself, which was to say remarkable. "Beef stew," she said. "The finest beef stew Crestwater can provide." She smiled then, fully, the kind of smile that changes a face entirely, and he felt the effect of it in a way that was warm and serious and final, the way you feel something that you already know you're not going to recover from. They ate dinner at the Douglas house in the small dining room with its oil lamp and its checkered tablecloth, and the beef stew was exactly as described, and it was one of the best meals either of them could remember. They talked for a long time, not about the case anymore, or not only about it, but about things they hadn't had room for during the intensity of the preparation. He told her about New Mexico and the failed ranch and the partnership that had dissolved badly, and she told him about the drought year and about her father during his last months, the way he had started telling her stories from his early life that she had never heard before, as if he was arranging something. He told her about law school in Missouri, and the professor who had told him he had a good legal mind but should think carefully about whether the law was where he belonged, and she told him about the summer when she was 17 and had wanted to attend the teachers' college in San Antonio, and her father had said she was welcome to go if she wanted, but he thought she would come back in a year because she was a rancher in her bones. "Were you angry about that?" Jacob asked. "Yes," she said, "for about 3 months. And then I realized he was right." She moved a piece of bread around the edge of her bowl. "I think there might be women who could have been something different if they'd been given the choice. I don't know that I was one of them. I think this is genuinely what I am." She looked up. "But I should have been given the choice to find that out for myself." "Yes," he said simply and completely. "You mean that?" "I do." She looked at him with the same measuring look she had used in every situation over the past 2 weeks, and he had learned by now that the look meant she was deciding whether to trust something. He let her look. "What happens now?" she said. "For you, I mean." He had been thinking about this. He had been thinking about it more specifically since the morning in the kitchen when she had agreed to dinner, and with even more specificity since she had taken his hand in the courtroom. "That depends," he said carefully, "on whether a person with a law degree and decent cattle sense might be of any use on a 1,200-acre ranch in Texas Hill Country." The lamp between them threw warm light, and the dining room was quiet because they were the last people in it, and Henrietta Brooks looked at Jacob Underwood across the checkered tablecloth and said, "I imagine that would depend on the terms." "Honest ones," he said, "and negotiated fairly." "Like beef cattle," she said, and smiled. "Slightly more complicated than beef cattle," he said, "but the principle is the same." She reached across the table and put her hand over his, and it was the deliberate version of what had happened in the courtroom, the chosen version, the one that said something clearly and meant it to be understood. "Stay," she said. I'm not saying it because I need a lawyer or because the ranch needs another hand, though both of those things are true. I'm saying it because the last 2 weeks have been difficult and also the best 2 weeks I've had in a long time, and I think that is primarily your fault." Jacob turned his hand over so their palms were together. "I will stay," he said. "For as long as you want." "I suspect," she said, "that might be a very long time." "I suspect," he said, "that is exactly what I'm hoping for." They rode back to the ranch in the dark, side by side on the road that wound through the cedar hills, the cold air sharp and clear and full of stars, and somewhere in the middle of that ride, he reached across and took her hand again, and she let him, and they rode the rest of the way like that, two people who had come together sideways and at speed and against considerable opposition, and had arrived somewhere that felt, in the simple way the best things do, exactly right. The weeks that followed were full and busy and gradually, beautifully, different from anything that had come before in either of their lives. Gerald Brooks did not contest the ruling. He had perhaps done a calculation involving the cost of an appeal against the certainty of its success, and found the numbers unpromising. He sent a letter to Henrietta 3 weeks after the hearing that was brief and formal and acknowledged the court's decision, and she wrote back a letter that was equally brief and equally formal, and after that the correspondence stopped. She did not pursue a grudge against him. She felt the truth of what she had said to him at the gate, that he knew what the truth was, and she thought that knowing that and having to live with it was sufficient punishment for what he tried to do. Jacob established himself on the ranch with the same gradual and practical process through which he did everything. He began by doing the work that needed doing, the kind of work that was always there on a 1,200-acre property, and that Henrietta had never quite had enough hands for. He repaired the north well pump, which had been sluggish all autumn, and got it running cleanly. He rebuilt the weakest section of the east fence with Tom Hatch, the two of them working through a cold November morning with a competence and compatibility that Tom found, he told Henrietta later, unexpectedly satisfying. He was good with the cattle, better, in fact, than his New Mexico story might have suggested. He had an instinct for it, a way of reading the herd that came from genuine long observation, and Henrietta watched him work and recognized something she knew how to identify after a lifetime of evaluating working ability, that this was a man who was good at this in a way that couldn't be faked or performed. He was also good at the law, and he began to put that to use in ways that served the ranch rather than courtrooms. He reviewed the property's water rights documentation and found 2 agreements that could be renegotiated to better terms, and conducted those renegotiations himself in ways that Henrietta observed and approved. He helped 3 neighboring small ranchers with legal questions for no fee, because the questions were straightforward and helping cost him nothing, and in a part of the world where communities depended on goodwill, goodwill was worth something. The romance between them unfolded without rushing and without drama, which suited both of their natures. They were people who dealt in realities and worked through their feelings in practical terms, which meant that what grew between them was built on the same solid base as everything else they did. Long evenings at the kitchen table, sometimes working, sometimes talking, sometimes sitting in the specific comfortable silence of people who have earned each other's presence. Rides out to the far reaches of the property in the low December light, when the hill country wore its winter colors and the air smelled of cold cedar, and the horses moved steadily, and the world was very large and very quiet around them. The gradual, inevitable progression of small touchings, a hand at her back when they stood at the fence looking at the cattle, fingers brushing when they passed documents, and then, one evening in early December when the stove was warm and they had been talking about the spring cattle plan for an hour, and had drifted somehow very close together, his hand at her face and her hand on his arm, and a kiss that was careful and decided, and then not careful at all. He asked her to marry him in January of 1883, on a bright cold morning when the frost was still on the grass, and they had ridden out to check the north herd together. They had stopped on a ridge that looked south over the whole property, the house and the barn and the cattle in the winter pastures and the cedar hills rolling away to the horizon, and he had said it simply, without preparation or elaborate speech, because she was not a woman who wanted elaborate speeches and he was not a man who made them. He said, "I want to spend the rest of my life here and I want to spend it with you. Will you marry me?" She looked at the land and then at him, and her answer was neither instant nor hesitant but considered in exactly the way she considered everything important, fully and honestly. Then she said yes. They were married in March of 1883, in a ceremony that took place on the ranch itself, because Henrietta said she had spent her adult life on this land, and she would be married on it, or she would be married nowhere, which suited Jacob entirely. The minister came out from Crestwater, a practical young man named Reverend Clark who had a theological education and a realistic understanding of where his congregation actually lived their lives. Tom Hatch stood with Jacob. Douglas Calloway and his wife attended. Dr. Payne came and brought his wife, and Eddie Park and Lem Briggs were there in their best clothes, and the handful of other neighbors and townspeople who had become genuine parts of the Brooks Ranch community were present too. Henrietta wore a dress she had made herself from blue wool, a practical and beautiful choice that suited her completely, and she walked across the grass to where Jacob was standing without being escorted, because she had considered the question and determined that she was walking herself to this marriage of her own free will, and that was the correct way to present it. She reached Jacob, and he looked at her with the expression she had come to know well over the months, the one that was full and direct and contained nothing held back, and she looked back at him the same way, and they said their vows in the March sunshine with the hill country spreading away in every direction around them. Tom Hatch, who had been on this ranch for 9 years and had seen William Brooks build it from almost nothing, stood through the ceremony with the stillness of someone who is managing something considerable, and afterward he shook Jacob's hand and then, unexpectedly, embraced Henrietta very briefly, and she heard him say quietly that her father would have been very pleased, and she held on to that for a long time. The first year of their marriage was a good one. They worked the ranch together, which they had been doing anyway, but with the settled quality that comes from something formal and declared. Jacob maintained his involvement in local legal matters on a case-by-case basis, handling things that neighbors brought him and occasionally corresponding with the law professor in Austin on questions of Texas property law. He and Henrietta talked often about the inequities built into the legal structure of property and inheritance as it applied to women, not with bitterness, but with the focused interest of people who had navigated those inequities directly and had thoughts about them. Jacob began writing down some of those thoughts. He drafted arguments for consideration of property rights in cases where women had demonstrably managed assets and had them published in a legal journal out of Austin in 1883. The law professor he had corresponded with during the hearing wrote back enthusiastically, and a correspondence began that would turn into a decades-long professional friendship. In the spring of 1884, their first child was born, a boy they named William, after Henrietta's father. He arrived in April, during the week when the bluebonnets came up in the south pasture, which Henrietta said was appropriate because her father had always loved that week. Jacob was in the house when William was born, which was not entirely usual for the time but was non-negotiable for him, and he held his son for the first time in the blue spring light of the bedroom window and felt something enormous and specific move through him. Henrietta watched him holding the baby from the bed where she had just done the hardest work of her life, and she thought that this was the version of her life she had wanted without knowing how to name it. The ranch and the work and this man, and now this small, heavy-breathing creature who was part of both of them. She said, "He has your ears." Jacob looked up. "Is that a good thing?" "I haven't decided yet," she said, and she was smiling. William Brooks Underwood grew into a sturdy and curious child who followed both his parents everywhere on the ranch, and who at the age of 2 was already doing his best to communicate with the horses. He had Henrietta's gray eyes and Jacob's square build, and the combined stubbornness of both his parents in a concentrated form that Tom Hatch said was going to be either magnificent or catastrophic, and possibly both. In 1885, Jacob's legal writing had grown enough of a reputation that he received an invitation to address a gathering of Texas attorneys in San Antonio on the question of inheritance law and women's property rights. He and Henrietta traveled together to San Antonio, leaving the ranch for 4 days in Tom Hatch's highly capable charge, and Jacob delivered his address to a room of about 40 lawyers and judges, including 2 who had been involved in cases similar to Henrietta's, and he was direct and specific, and he cited her case as a central example. He said, standing before those 40 men, that the legal presumption of a woman's incapacity to manage property was not a neutral position, it was an active choice, and that the evidence of his own direct experience contradicted it completely and specifically. He said the names: Henrietta Brooks Underwood, the case, the evidence, the outcome. He said that Judge Ford's decision had been based on the correct reading of the available evidence, and that the court had been right to deny a petition that rested on assumption rather than fact, and he said that he hoped the room would consider, in their own future practice, the difference between an assumption and a demonstration. The room was mixed in its response. Some men were visibly uncomfortable. Some were thoughtful. 2 of them afterward sought Jacob out to discuss specific cases where similar questions had arisen, and those conversations were long and serious, and he came away from them believing that the law was slow and imperfect and capable of change. Henrietta had sat in the back of the room during the address and listened to her husband speak, and she had felt, not for the first time, the particular quality of being known. Not in the general sense of being understood, but in the specific sense of having someone who had seen everything you were, and had no reservations about saying so in public, clearly and without apology. She had told him on the road back to the ranch that she was glad he had used her name. "I didn't ask you first," he said. "I should have." "No," she said. "It was right to use it. I want it on record, not for my sake only but for the next woman in a courtroom somewhere who needs someone to have said it already." He had looked at her with that expression, and she had looked back, and they had ridden through the Cedar Hills in the late afternoon light like 2 people who had found in each other not just love, but an understanding so complete that it was indistinguishable from love. In 1886, their second child was born, a girl they named Clara, who came in October and arrived with a vigor and immediacy that suggested she had no intention of waiting for anyone's convenience. Clara had Jacob's brown eyes and Henrietta's directness, and from a very young age expressed opinions about everything in her environment with an authority that made the family laugh and occasionally despair. William adored her with the simple totality of a 2-year-old boy encountering a sister, and by the time Clara was walking, the 2 of them were engaged in a continuous joint investigation of the ranch that required supervision at all times. Tom Hatch, who had by then been foreman for 14 years, had appointed himself a kind of honorary uncle to both children, and could frequently be found explaining cattle or fence construction, or weather patterns to 2 small people who listened to him with complete seriousness. The ranch expanded in 1887, when Henrietta negotiated the purchase of 200 additional acres to the south from a family who was returning to their relatives in the east. The negotiation was conducted by both Jacob and Henrietta, with Jacob handling the legal documentation and Henrietta assessing the land and the cattle on it. And they worked in the specific efficient partnership of people who have learned each other's strengths over years, and have found the arrangement not just functional but genuinely pleasurable. The additional acreage was turned over and integrated into the ranch's operations over the following year, with the thoroughness that characterized everything they did. And by 1888, the Brooks Ranch, which was how it was still known in the community, was one of the strongest medium-sized cattle operations in Bixar County. Gerald Brooks died in 1888 of a heart ailment, according to the short notice that arrived from Austin via a lawyer handling his estate. He had never married and had no children, and his estate was modest, primarily his banking investments. Henrietta received a formal letter informing her that a small bequest had been left to her, not a large sum but not nothing, and the accompanying note from the Austin lawyer said simply that Mr. Brooks had expressed in his final will that his niece had managed her affairs with considerable skill. It was the closest thing to an acknowledgement that Gerald could manage, and it came too late to mean much practically, but Henrietta read it once and then folded it away and kept it. Jacob, when she showed it to him, read it carefully and then said, "He knew. He always knew," she said. "That was why he tried so hard to stop it, because he knew I could do it, and that meant there was no other argument." Jacob folded the letter back and returned it to her. "Do you feel resolved about it?" She thought for a moment. "Yes," she said, "I do." She was 30 years old by then, and the woman she had been at 24, standing at a fence with wire cutters in her hand, watching a stranger ride up, was visible in her, but had been built upon in every direction. She was a rancher and a wife and a mother and a documented manager of a successful property, and the subject of a legal case that had been cited in print 3 times since 1883. She wore her hair differently now, sometimes down around the ranch when she felt like it, which she had been too careful about in the early years, and she had a laugh that came out fully when it came, the kind that takes up the full room. Jacob Underwood was 34 and had the permanent outdoor look of a man who had spent the better part of a decade under Texas weather, and he had gray at his temples now that had come early, and that William and Clara both found fascinating for different reasons. William because he had decided it looked distinguished, and Clara because she had decided to see if it would continue spreading until it covered everything. He still worked cattle and he still did legal work, and the combination of those two things had given him a particular and useful standing in the community that he didn't calculate or pursue, but that had simply accumulated over years of doing both things honestly. He remained the person Henrietta trusted most in the world, not because she depended on him. She had never needed to depend on anyone in the supplanting sense, but because trust built over years of shared work and shared life and shared difficulty is the most durable kind, and theirs had been tested in the earliest weeks of their acquaintance and had held, and had only grown stronger since. In the evenings they still sat at the kitchen table, sometimes with papers and ledgers, sometimes with nothing but coffee and conversation, and the kitchen was the same, and the lamp was the same, and the sound of children sleeping somewhere upstairs was new and good and part of the picture now. Tom Hatch retired in 1890 at 60 years old, and they gave him a small retirement celebration on the ranch with all the hands and neighbors present. And Jacob gave a brief and genuine speech about what Tom Hatch had meant to the Brooks Ranch over 15 years. And Tom sat through it with the dignity of a man who is unaccustomed to ceremony, but is moved by the honesty of it. He didn't go far in his retirement, settling in a small house in Crestwater that was close enough to ride out to the ranch when he wanted to, which was fairly often. A young foreman named Samuel Reyes took the position, a man of 26 who had come up from the South and who had worked cattle since he was a boy, and who had the combination of physical skill and practical intelligence that Henrietta had always looked for in her people. She hired him herself, interviewed him at the kitchen table, asked questions about cattle management and water use and employee relations, and made her decision within an hour. Jacob had watched the interview and then told her afterward that she could have taught the process to a school. "I've been doing it for 12 years, she said. "I know, it shows." William turned 8 in 1892 and was already working alongside the adults in the way that ranch children do. His responsibilities scaled to his age but genuinely counted upon, and he had his mother's serious approach to things that needed doing and his father's tendency to ask questions about why things worked the way they did. He had also, from somewhere, acquired a gift for numbers that showed up early in the way he absorbed ledger arithmetic, and Henrietta watched this with a quiet private pleasure, because her father had told her once that his own capacity for numbers had been the first thing that told him he might survive at ranching. Clara at 6 was a hurricane in a dress, and had already informed everyone in the family that she intended to learn to ride properly, not the side-saddle compromise that was standard for women of the time, but properly. And Henrietta had looked at Jacob, and Jacob had looked at Henrietta, and they had both decided independently and simultaneously that this was not a battle they intended to fight against their daughter. The third child, a boy named Thomas after Tom Hatch, came in 1893, the September of it, born in the same bedroom as his siblings, and he was a big tranquil baby who slept long and well, and regarded the noisy world of his family with a philosophical equanimity from the beginning that made everyone around him feel slightly calmer. By the time Thomas was born, the Brooks Ranch was 12 years past the morning Henrietta had walked into her father's study with a tin mug of coffee and found him gone, and 22 months past the morning Jacob had ridden up to the east fence line with nothing but a horse and a law degree, and a willingness to say that what he had heard in a livery stable was wrong. Henrietta, sitting with Thomas in her arms in the first quiet hour after his birth, with the September sunlight coming in golden through the bedroom window, and Jacob sitting on the chair beside the bed with his elbows on his knees, and his face showing the particular open expression he wore in unguarded moments, thought about all the things that had to have gone a specific way for this to be what her life was. Her father had to have built this ranch, and believed in her enough to teach her everything. Gerald had to have tried to take it, which had required Jacob. Jacob had to have stopped in Crestwater with a horse that needed a shoe and a habit of listening to men talking in livery stables. And then 2 weeks of hard work and honest conversation and the gradual particular recognition of one person for another, and 12 years from there. "What are you thinking?" Jacob asked. He asked it in the way he always asked it, directly and with genuine interest. "About livery stables," she said. He laughed, that warm, certain laugh of his that she had heard for the first time at the kitchen table when she'd made a dry remark about the petition language, and had known even then that she was in trouble. Specifically, he said, "How much happens by accident," she said, "and how strange it is that the accidents are the best parts." He reached over and touched her face briefly with the back of his fingers, the way he had been touching her face for 12 years, with the specific tenderness of someone who considers what they are touching to be the most important thing in their vicinity. "Not entirely accident," he said. "I chose to come. You chose to let me stay." "We chose," she agreed. Thomas made a sound of mild opinion from her arms, and they both looked down at him, and then at each other. And the golden light was in the room, and the ranch stretched away outside the window in every direction, healthy and alive and tended, and all 3 of their other children were somewhere in the house being supervised by Samuel Reyes's wife Maria, who had become part of the household in the easy, inevitable way that necessary and good people do. And in the room, it was just the 2 of them, and the new baby and everything they had built together, which was more than either of them had known how to ask for at the beginning. In the years that followed, Jacob's written arguments on property rights continued to find their way into legal conversations across Texas and beyond. He was asked twice more to address gatherings of attorneys, and both times Henrietta came with him and sat in the audience and listened to her husband argue the case she had lived, and both times she found it moved her in a way that was not small. He was offered a formal legal position in San Antonio twice, and both times turned it down, because the ranch was where he belonged and he had known it since the first morning. He had ridden up the slope and looked at the fences and the cattle and the kitchen garden, and understood that this property had been tended with love. Henrietta expanded the breeding program in 1895 with a careful investment in two excellent bulls that improved the herd quality significantly over the following 3 seasons. And the decision was hers from evaluation to execution, and yielded exactly the results she had projected, which gave her a satisfaction she never outgrew in the way that good professional judgment, well executed, never loses its pleasure. William, by 15, was a genuine working partner in the ranch's operations, sitting with his parents over the ledgers in the evenings with the same attentiveness he had brought to everything since childhood. And Henrietta watched him and felt her father in him, and felt Jacob in him, and felt herself in him, and was glad for all three of those things. Clara rode beautifully, properly, and had inherited enough of both her parents' characters to be formidable in debate and precise in work, and had also informed the family, at 14, that she intended to study medicine someday, which was a statement that Henrietta had responded to by saying that was an admirable intention. And what did Clara know about the current options for women in that field, and they would research it together. Jacob had said when Henrietta told him about this conversation, "Of course you said that. What would you have said?" "The same thing," he said. "I'd have said it second." Thomas, the youngest, was a quiet, steady child with a gift for the land that showed itself in the way he watched the weather and read the grass, and understood the cattle in the herd's language rather than the observers. He was 8 years old in 1901, and already had opinions about soil quality that his father could not fault. The ranch was whole and running and alive. The house was warm and full and permanent. The land that William Brooks had carved out of the Texas hill country in the long, hard years of his life was in the hands of the family he had made, and the family that family had made, and it was better kept than it had ever been, and would be better still in the years ahead. On an October evening in 1901, 19 years after the morning, a young woman had walked into her father's study with a tin cup of coffee, and found the world changed. Henrietta Brooks Underwood sat on the porch of the ranch house she had grown up in and would grow old in, and watched the sun go down behind the cedar hills. The sky was the particular deep orange and rose of a Texas autumn sunset, the kind that looked too dramatic to be real and was entirely real, and the cattle in the south pasture were still and dark against it, and the air smelled of cool cedar and turned grass, and the particular clean smell of a working ranch at the end of a good day. Jacob came out through the screen door and sat beside her in the other chair, the one that had been his for 19 years, and handed her a cup of coffee without asking, because he had known for 19 years how she took her coffee and when she wanted it. She took it, and they sat in the last of the light and did not speak for a while, which was the most comfortable silence in her life. After a time she said, "I was thinking today about what Doyle Cummings said, about sophisticated financial decision-making." "Were you?" Jacob said. "The new breeding contract I finalized today is worth more than the entire ranch was appraised at in 1882. Jacob looked at her with that gold-brown gaze of his. "Is that right?" "I thought you might like to know," she said. "I never doubted it," he said. She smiled, and the smile was the full version, the one that took up the whole room, and in this case the room was the wide Texas evening with all its sky and all its light and all its cedars, and it fit exactly. "Neither did I," she said. And the sun went down behind the hills, and the stars came out over the hill country, and the ranch was alive and whole under them, and it was hers, and it was his, and it was theirs, and there was nothing unresolved in any direction, nothing unfinished, nothing taken away that had not been returned with interest, nothing at all but the good weight of a life built well and shared honestly between two people who had found each other by accident, and then chosen each other every day after.